One of the things you'll notice in the Photoshop for Photographers book is that I give a lot of prominence to working with Camera Raw. And in fact, I place it ahead of teaching you how to work with the main image adjustment tools in Photoshop itself. The reason I do this is because if you're shooting digitally, and especially if you're shooting in RAW mode, then Camera Raw is really the first place that you want to go to when you open up an image and before you do anything to it in Photoshop. So what I'm going to do in this movie tutorial is just run through some of the basic controls that you use in Camera Raw. I'm not going to talk about sharpening because that's covered in another separate movie, but I just want to really just guide you through to working with the main tone and color editing controls. And I'm going to choose this picture here, not for any special reason, but it's a pretty good typical photograph to work with. And what I'll do is just double click to open this up into the Camera Raw dialog and run through the controls that we have here. Now you'll notice that to start with that we're looking at the basics panel controls, and what I'm going to do now is just first of all, before doing anything in the basic panel, go to the camera calibration panel. Now you don't normally start off going here, or we haven't done in the past, because camera calibration is regarded as something of an expert user's panel only. But in Camera Raw 5 that comes with Photoshop CS4, what Adobe have done is given you these new profiles to work with, and these are akin to working with what some people prefer to call camera looks. It allows you to choose different starting points for all the processing that you're about to do to an image. And so far, judging from the forums, it seems to have got quite a lot of attention and got people quite excited. So for example, previously you had just the ACR 3.6 or 4.4, whatever the ACR, this stands for Adobe Camera Raw, profile settings were available, and usually you would choose whichever was the most recent out of the two. It so happens I still prefer working with the standard ACR settings, and that's what I'm going to work with today. But I want to show you the alternatives because down here, for example, you've got the standard interpretation. This is based on what would be the an almost identical colorimetric rendering to that color setting you would get if you were using, say, the JPEG capture mode. So what the standard option does is that it attempts to match the standard JPEG rendering for each individual camera. And this is actually based on measurements that have been made by Adobe to try and, for a limited number of cameras, to try and get the raw processing camera profile to match what you see when you open up a JPEG version. I know a lot of photographers who've been unfamiliar with working with Camera Raw and what it does have been dismayed when they've opened up images and they've seen the initial rendering on the screen, which is the camera JPEG rendering, and then seen the colors all change. They've gone to something different from what they saw initially, and a lot of people have said, well, I prefer the JPEG version. I want to just see that with Camera Raw. Well, now you can choose this this option, set it as a default. You'll find instructions on how to do that in the book. Set that as the default, and then you'll see your raw images start off from the same standpoint as your JPEG versions. So in addition to that, there are different versions too. There's portrait, neutral, landscape. All of these produce slightly different color interpretations, and they're just a starting point that you might want to work with, including the new Adobe versions as well. But I just generally prefer to just stick with the ACR profiles. There's a lot that you can do when we start going over to the basic panel and work with the adjustments here, of course. So let's start with the white balance. You'll notice that the default here says as shot, which means whatever the camera white balance was applied to the image when it was captured in the camera, which could be, say, the average white balance setting, or it could have been a set setting that the camera used. Whatever that was, this is the setting that Camera Raw will read and use to start with. But it's just a setting, and you can change it. You can choose one of the preset options down here. For example, you could choose the flash, fluorescent, tungsten. You can see that with each of these different white balance settings, it adjusts the sliders below and produces a different color interpretation. Most of the time I prefer to use the as shot setting, and then if I want to change it, rather than using the sliders down there, there are two other options. One is to choose the white balance tool and then click on an area of the image which I think should be white, not picking a bright specular highlight like the highlight I got here, but choosing a white that's perhaps more sort of typical of the whites in the picture. Just choosing something slightly less bright than a specular white. That's one way of doing it, or else alternatively I can use the sliders over here, and you'll notice that the coloration of the slider control gives you a hint of what's going to happen. So if you drag the slider to the left, then it's going to make the color temperature cooler, and if you drag it more to the right, you can make it warmer. Down below you've got the tint slider that allows you to apply a green or magenta bias to the color temperature settings, so you can make that more green or you can make it go more magenta. Well, in this instance I'm going to leave it pretty much where it was and just concentrate on perhaps making the image a little bit warmer than it was in using the original as shot value. For the rest of the sliders that you see down here, the intention is that you work through these in more or less the same order as you see them. It doesn't really matter if you choose to start somewhere else, because it doesn't make any difference to the order in which they're applied. When you eventually process this image, all the settings are applied exactly at the same time. But I think you'll find it better to start with the exposure slider first, because what this does is it allows you to decide, naturally enough, how bright do you want the picture to be. Do you want it to be underexposed, or do you want to increase the exposure? As you do this, you do want to be mindful as to what might happen to the white point in the image, so that you don't clip the values too much. If you want to be absolutely sure that you're not clipping them, you can, if you like, hold down the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on a PC, and you can look to see what happens in this threshold mode display to see where there's any clipping occurring. And I can see as I run the cursor over some of these points that we are getting to the point where some of these values will become clipped. But generally I think that you should not be using it in that particular way. You can see where the clipping is occurring, and that might influence your decision, but generally use the on-screen image to adjust the photograph to see where you get the right looking balance that you're happy with on the exposure, and I'm going to decide to leave it set around there. When it comes to making sure that you don't burn out or lose any of the important highlight detail, let's just look at the image at 100% now, just to look at this picture in close-up. When it comes to sort of looking at areas of important detail where you don't want to lose the highlights, let's just find this area. I think this is a good one to work with. You can use the recovery slider to bring back in some of that lost detail. Can you see how I drag across more to the right? It actually restores some of the details and the highlights that might otherwise have become lost. And essentially, with areas like this, for example, where you've got these shiny reflections, such as on this leaf, then we really don't mind these burning out to white, because those are just specular highlights that we don't worry if we lose any detail when it comes to print. But the areas down here, that is more important that we make sure that we retain enough information in those parts of the picture so that we definitely don't lose any highlight detail there. Now let me just go back to a normal 100% view, back to a fit in view. Now looking at the image as a whole, having set the exposure and adjusted the recovery, I don't think I'm going to use the fill light just yet. I usually go straight down to the blacks, because the blacks allows us to set the black clipping point. And if you hold down the Option key here or the Alt key on a PC, you can see that as you drag across to the right, you can see where the black clipping point is going to take place. And you can also analyze it visually, but I think I prefer generally to use the Option Alt slider just to try and judge where the blacks are just beginning to clip. And from my point of view, I'm sort of quite happy to let these blacks go and clip as close to zero as possible. And in case you feel that runs counter to other information you might have been given, then I'm going to explain that a little bit later at the end of this, after I process this image. But for now I'm just going to go and leave the black set around there, because I'm quite happy with the contrast I'm getting into the picture between the shadow points and between the highlights. With the fill light slider, well, you can actually use this as kind of like a bounce reflector, just to kick in a little bit more light into the shadow areas. If you take it too far to the right, you get this rather unnatural look, and this really kills all the mood in the picture completely. So be careful about not overdoing it too much. But you'll find that just by adding a small amount of fill light in a photograph like this, that it actually helps to fill in some of the detail in the shadows, and that will help when it comes to printing a photograph like this. Next we have the brightness slider, which also causes confusion for some users, because what's the difference between working with brightness and working with exposure? I would say that it's important to use the exposure first as your primary means for adjusting the brightness of an image, and then after you've applied the other adjustments that I've shown you, like the recovery, blacks and the fill light, then use the brightness slider to fine-tune and adjust the brightness to get it looking just right, so that you want to use the brightness after you've worked with exposure. And if you refer to the book, as I say, you'll see an example in there which shows you the pros, the reasons why you must use exposure first and the dangers of using brightness as your first primary adjustment, followed by using exposure. Then below that we've got the contrast slider, which, as you might expect, as you drag it more to the right, you increase the contrast, and as you drag it to the left, you make the contrast softer. And this is quite an effective tool for adjusting the contrast in a photograph. But you do also have the tone curve panel as well that you can refer to. And there are two modes to this. You've got the point curve editor and you've got the parametric editor. These days I do pretty much everything using the parametric curve adjustments. If I show you just briefly how this works, you can see it as I, for example, drag the shadow slider to the left, I can increase the contrast down in the lower portion of the curve, and as I drag on the highlight slider, I can add more contrast up into the upper portion of the curve, in the midtones to the highlights. So using these sliders, you can manipulate the shape of the curve to adjust the image, and you can look at the images you're doing this to see the effect that these have. You can eventually sort of end up with getting just about the right amount of contrast, but with 4 control sliders to work with, as opposed to the single control slider that you have in the basic panel. Then also don't forget that you've got these additional sliders. So in actual fact you've got 7 sliders to work with, where you can target the adjustment for, say, the shadows down more to the very bottom end of the toe. And I find I use this technique quite a lot. I very often take this split slider down more to the left, and then take the shadows slider down more, so that I just really just boost the contrast down at the very, very bottom end of the picture, the bottom end of the tonal scale. Now let's go back to the basic panel. We've just got a few sliders left to look at. We've got the clarity slider next, which I can only really show you effectively if I take the percentage to 100%. And what this is basically a mid-tone adjustment tool. So it increased the mid-tone contrast. You'll notice as I drag more to the right, it increases the contrast in the mid-tone areas. So by increasing the clarity, we can add more contrast into the leaves. You also have the ability to apply a negative clarity now, which can sometimes be quite a nice creative effect for taking the contrast down in the mid-tone areas. But most photographs, I think, you'll find would benefit from having, say, a 10 or 20 amount added to of clarity. This isn't exactly the same as sharpening. Don't get confused between clarity and sharpening. What this does is adding a localized mid-tone contrast to the image, just to give it a little bit more presence. Let's now zoom out to the fit-in view. And now looking at the image, let me just take that brightness up just a little bit more there. Let's just make that slightly brighter again. Now let's look at the vibrance and the saturation. They appear on the surface to do the same thing. If you increase the saturation, it certainly makes the image look more saturated, and likewise you can take the saturation down. But generally I prefer to work just with the vibrance, and the reason for this is because with certain colours, like for example these red chilies and to a certain extent the green in the leaves, the problem with using the saturation slider is that it boosts all the colours evenly in saturation. So colours that are already saturated enough, like for example the red chilies and maybe some of the green colours here, don't really need to be saturated anymore. Whereas with the vibrant slider, it saturates the image, but it boosts most of the saturation in the weaker colours. So the colours that need more saturation boost, they get the saturation increase, whereas the colours that are already saturated get less of a saturation boost. So by increasing the vibrance, you can get a much cleaner and more effective saturation boost, and you don't get the problems that are associated with the saturation slider, namely clipping taking place in the brightly saturated colours. So that kind of adjustment I think would be pretty much enough to finish all the adjustments I need to do here. I haven't done anything with the detail panel. I would normally go to the detail panel, but I cover that separately in another movie tutorial on this DVD, so I'm not going to bother with that for now. So let's just open this image up and bring it into Photoshop. And here's the photograph now in Photoshop, ready for us to look at. And what I'm going to finish off doing here is just to go through the process of converting this image to CMYK, or converting it ready to go to print, and show you the difference this has on the histogram. If we change the histogram to a luminosity view, You can see here the full range of tones that we've got on the photograph, going through from the blacks, where I was aiming to clip at 000, going through to the highlights, making sure, as I explained earlier, that we didn't clip any important highlight detail here, and so that those soft tone highlights, those important highlight tones, we make sure that they get preserved when they go through to print. But with the blacks, this is where it gets confusing, because sometimes you'll be told that you need to set the black point in an image using the levels adjustment in Photoshop to something like, say, 10, 10, 10 for the RGB values, or maybe even as high as 25, 25, 25. And the reason for this really dates back to the old days of Photoshop, way before we had color management. And the point I'm making here is that now we do have color management in Photoshop. The profile conversion process takes care of converting the black point for you, so you don't really need to do this manually in levels. And just to illustrate that, let's take this image into a CMYK space by going to the Edit menu, and I'll choose Convert to Profile and select a CMYK profile here. Let's choose the US Web Uncoated. Click OK. And you can see what happens to the histogram as I do a before and after. There's the before image and there's the after. Did you see what happened to the shadow point? Let me just pinpoint that there now. You can also see in the image itself, as I toggle between the two, can you see also that the blacks appear slightly less intense, they're slightly less darker than they were before. And what's happening here is that part of the profile conversion is actually converting the black points for you in each of the color channels. So you don't need to do it manually in levels. The profile conversion process takes care of that for you. And the other point I want to make here is that it's different with each different process. So that shows you a CMYK conversion. But look what happens if I go to the Convert to Profile and choose an RGB profile to convert to. Let's say, for example, we choose a matte paper surface, such as a profile for the 7600 Epson printer using Hahnemuhle rag paper. Let's convert to that, and you'll see now that the histogram changes a lot. There's the before version and there's after. And you can also see in the image itself, you'll see how there is a big change there in the shadows. You can see that the shadows become lighter. And this has now set the shadow point to a much brighter value than was required for the CMYK conversion. So the lesson to learn here is that setting the levels manually to, say, a value of 10, 10, 10, 10 or 20, 20, 20 or whatever you're told is really an arbitrary figure to choose, because there is no set value that's going to be right for every print process. And typically you might take a photograph like this and convert it to CMYK to go into a book or a magazine, and you might convert it to a print paper surface, maybe a glossy print paper, or to a matte paper profile, and in each case the black point needs to be set differently. But so as not to panic you, if you have been in the habit of setting your values to 10, 10, 10 or something conservative around that figure, it's not going to have a harmful effect on any conversion you do to CMYK or converting to print, because in almost every case, the amount that you need to, that the profile conversion will adjust the black points to will be around about that level, but sometimes it will be more. All I'm saying is that it's not really worthwhile doing it. It's actually, there's no benefit to be gained from setting the levels manually. So basically the lessons I've taught you in using Camera Raw is use the tone adjustments there in the way I've described. Make sure that you don't clip the highlight detail. Don't be worried about clipping to black, because the profile conversion will take care of that for you. And the other things you've learnt in here is about how to use things like the fill light control and the tone curve panel to fine-tune the contrast in the image. Well, that concludes this tutorial. You'll find a lot more information about this in chapter 3 in the book. And don't forget also to check out the movie where I show you how to use the sharpening controls when you're working with Camera Raw.